here. We have Professor Barry Bloom, who's recognized as a pioneer in the field of global health, trained in immunology. He's made important contributions to infectious diseases, vaccines, and global health policy. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Now, it's been around 7 months of coronavirus, 7 months of this pandemic. There's been a lot of change and learning about the disease. What are the most important things that we've learned about dealing with it?
Finally, quite surprising was that often people under treatment seemingly getting better will rapidly deteriorate because of a dramatic over-immune equivalent of a shock response that is extremely difficult to protect against. And finally, what we've learned is that if one looks at the severest consequences of COVID, they primarily attack people over the age of 60. And so there has been a sparing of the serious aspects to young people. Although young people and children are capable of being infected, relatively few have died. And so this is a disease, the fatal consequences of which really primarily affect elderly populations. And one of the major differences between India and the United States is the age of the populations in India are very much younger on average than in the United States, so that the majority of people who've been affected in India, as I understand it, are in the younger ages group because that is the most abundant set of the population. And hence the question of why the case numbers in India are high, but the death rates are so much lower than in the US. I would say a major reason for that is the age of the population that is most infected. We have a much older population on average, and it is that population that has the most severe consequences. And finally, what we've learned is that there are, particularly among younger people infected, COVID positive, that are perfectly healthy, unaware that they are infected, are perfectly capable of transmitting the disease to other people, even though they are asymptomatic. And that means that while kids may be highly resistant, if they live in multifamily households, healthy people can transmit to elderly people, parents and grandparents, who are then much more susceptible to the serious consequences of the disease. So in summary, we have learned a great deal more than we knew 6 months ago. And also we have a great deal more to learn, particularly about how to combat the disease, how to prevent people from dying, and how to protect people both at a public health level and to protect people by the development of new vaccines.
All right, doctor. Now, what about all these new findings that are now emerging about the impact the disease is having on people? We're hearing about brain damage, and also, as you were talking about young people, how many of them have recovered, but they continue feeling very, very exhausted. So the symptoms linger for a very long time.
So I believe that, as I indicated initially, everybody thought it was an upper respiratory disease like a severe influenza. And indeed, it is a lower respiratory disease that can cause very severe damages to lungs. It is diagnosable to an extent by x-rays that show the damage to the lungs. And to answer your question, what we're finding is that even in young people who recover, there is often residual damage that is detectable both by function analysis, where the lungs don't function very well, for long periods of time, or by even x-rays when people feel recovered, there is still residual visible damage to the lungs. The cause of death in many of the people who die is an attack on the heart and the cardiovascular system, which is very serious and very difficult to treat. because the receptor for the virus is something called ACE2, which is a receptor that modulates blood pressure, and hence most blood vessels and many cells of the cardiac system have receptors for the virus. That is not true for flu, and that makes this a much more serious virus. And then, as you said, there are long-term consequences in people who've recovered. And recovery is often not very rapid. It can make people weak for months at a time. And we don't know if there are some people who will never develop full function and recovery. And one of the concerns is damage to blood vessels in the brain during the acute illness can lead to things like hallucinations, but upon recovery leads to things like memory loss and confusion that we still don't fully understand. And there are a number of studies, long-term follow-up, but we've only had this disease, if you can think about it, for 7 months. There is no long-term follow-up because the disease hasn't been around long enough. So I am confident that both medical scientists in India and certainly in the US are following quite carefully those who've recovered to learn what interventions, whether drugs or nutrition or fluid intake, can speed up the recovery to normal biological function.
All right. Also,
bottom line is this is a very serious disease.
Absolutely. Now, is there a chance of reinfection after you've recovered from the disease? People who have got mild infections, it's being said that they do have a chance of catching it again.
So those are very, very good questions, and I can say with certainty that we don't know the answers. And anyone who pretends to know that if you have an antibody test that's positive, whether you are for sure protected, is not scientifically providing the correct answer. So these are questions, because this is a 7-month new epidemic, that we can only learn from long-term studies. There are challenges at the moment to identifying the best tests for antibody. And I'm optimistic that by the end of the summer, we'll have a very good idea which tests seem to correlate best with protection. We know that there are antibodies that, like the monoclonals, that neutralize the virus and really render people or monkeys who receive the antibodies protected against infection. So we know that those antibodies are made in some people. But the question you raised is, in which people? How many people make antibodies? And the evidence is that relative to other virus infections like measles or even influenza, the amounts of antibody made even from people who recover from this coronavirus are relatively in low amounts, and we don't understand them. Many of them do make antibodies that are neutralizing, but we do not know how much antibody you need to assure that some viruses won't slip through and cause infection. So these are really big questions that we don't know. How, even if you make an immune response, how can we predict who's protected and who is susceptible? And then the second question is, for people who do make antibodies, it again appears from laboratory measurements, the antibodies don't hang around for very long, maybe a year, maybe less in some people. That may be true for vaccines as well, or maybe vaccines will be able to do better than natural infection. But we have to study those people who've recovered for much longer periods of time to see whether they are being reinfected and whether they get no disease, attenuated disease, or possibly even a worse disease with an immune shock syndrome that they never had the first time. And these are things that require long-term immunological research following people who've been infected, do make antibodies to know how protective they are, in whom they are, and how long they last.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Bloom, for joining us on NDTV.